Today is Monday, June 23rd, 2025. This is the Quick Start podcast from CBN News. I'm Billy Hollowell. On today's show, tensions continue to rise between the U.S. and Iran after President Donald Trump authorized strikes on 3 key Iranian nuclear facilities. We'll have that top story and more on today's show, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Be sure to subscribe to the show, give us a rating, and send your thoughts. Our email is quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. You can also head over to cbn.com/quickstartpodcast. Joining me today is Trey Goins-Phillips. Trey, there is a horrific situation that just unfolded in Syria. What will you be talking about today?
Yeah, so unfortunately, at least 20 people, that's according to preliminary numbers, were killed in a Damascus church bombing attack, and dozens others were wounded. So we'll be breaking down that story.
Yeah, that one's been lost a little bit in the headlines too, because so much is going on. So we'll get into that today. And on the main thing, this week marks the 3rd anniversary of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Madison Seals will be talking to a representative from Susan B. Anthony list. So we'll be getting into that as well. Make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN podcasts. We've got Newsmakers, Faith and Culture, Navigating Trump 2.0, and Heaven Meets Earth. A lot of great content to check out. Now, let's dive into the news in 90. President Trump announced Saturday night that the U.S. military struck 3 nuclear sites in Iran, directly joining Israel's effort to neutralize the Iranian nuclear program. As part of America's Operation Midnight Hammer, B-2 stealth bombers used bunker busters to target 2 of the facilities, and a 3rd was targeted through other means. It's unclear how Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei will inevitably react, though Iran has continued firing missiles at Israel even after President Trump's warning to seek diplomatic solutions. President Trump said, quote, "There will either be peace or there will be tragedy for Iran, far greater than we have witnessed over the last 80 years. He said that in an effort to push Iran toward a peaceful solution. Meanwhile, church staff at a house of worship in Wayne, Michigan, reportedly shot and killed an active shooter Sunday after the individual opened fire outside the church. The suspect reportedly drove erratically Sunday morning before getting out of the vehicle with a long gun, a handgun, and a tactical vest, and open firing. A church member apparently then struck the individual with a vehicle. At that point, 2 church members shot the accused, and the individual died. There was 1 non-life-threatening injury that was sustained by a security guard. Wayne Police Chief Ryan Strong, he expressed gratitude for the heroic actions of church members who stepped in. He said that they stopped a, quote, large-scale mass shooting and that their actions prevented dozens of people from being murdered. And we've got a story over at cbnnews.com, a woman named Vanessa Joy Lancelotti. She has an incredible story that's getting attention. She had a sudden life-threatening brain bleed, and she claims she died almost and met Jesus, had one of those heaven visitation stories. She was in the back of an ambulance and said she was swept up into what she called paradise and was standing face to face with Christ. It's a pretty incredible story. She survived, returned, and is now sharing that story about how she believes Jesus saved her life. You can find out more at cbnnews.com. Trey, a lot going on in the headlines today. We threw that last story in there because it's a feel-good story, but there's a lot happening that I think is creating a lot of tension and fear in people's lives, especially as they watch what's happening with Israel and Iran and now the U.S. involvement. What do you make of Iran's reaction to this so far?
Yeah, I think the Iranian reaction has certainly been interesting. It's been it's been odd seeing Khamenei kind of hidden, right? We haven't seen anything or heard anything directly from him. We've heard responses from other Iranian officials. There have been some who've come out and said Iran is vowing some sort of response to the strikes on the nuclear sites. So they haven't been entirely silent. But we haven't heard really much at all from the leader himself, the supreme leader himself. So it'll be interesting to see in the days to come. When does he come out? Where does he come out? What does he say? Because obviously Trump has not minced words, right? He said that if there is any sort of retaliation, at least on U.S. bases, anywhere around the world, in any way, the United States will be reacting with overwhelming power. So it seems like the supreme leader is I don't know, hiding at this point, but, we'll see. I know it's kind of early. These just happened on Saturday, so maybe we'll get a response from him at some point today.
Well, I think, for so many years it was rhetoric and proxy wars, and now you have very direct war. You have,
Right.
you have Israel and Iran exchanging very serious blows back and forth. And now you have, the US, dropping these bombs and essentially getting involved in this. The ante has been upped now. And so the other factor is you have Russia and China and all these other key players. And I've been sort of watching the rest of the world too and wondering, well, how are other countries going to react to this, right? Because this holds the ability or the potential to grow into something massive or to simmer and fizzle out, but it doesn't seem so far as though Iran is going to stop, right? I mean, it seems like they've decided, at least right now at this moment that we're speaking, that they have no plans of backing down. So it's going to be interesting where it all shakes out. And that brings us today to our focus story that we were talking a little bit about earlier. Trey, you're tackling this recent church bombing in Syria. What details do we know about what unfolded there?
So, according to reports, there's a suicide bomber who began firing at Mar Elias Church on the outskirts of Damascus on Sunday morning as parishioners there were praying. It's a Catholic church. And a witness who survived the attack said that he saw the attacker, who was with two others. Those two ultimately fled the scene, but the suicide bomber, a jihadist with ISIS, according to Syrian government officials, began shooting at the church before going inside and detonating bombs that killed, of course, himself and at least 20 other Christians and wounded dozens others. And that's numbers according to preliminary reports. So those numbers could go up.
You hear these stories and you think about the story we just covered before about the church members in America that stopped that Minnesota church shooting, but this seems like something we hear in some of these countries again and again and again, these horrific situations. They're not one-offs, they're happening routinely. What is the situation in Syria? I know it's hard for people because there's so much happening in every country around the world, but what's the situation there for Christians?
Yeah, so as with just about everything in the Middle East, this is a really complex question to answer. So, under the Assad regime, Christians had some modicum of safety. However, that was pretty fragile. Assad wanted to be respected on the international stage, and he was willing to, even if just in the name of being pragmatic, he was willing to cater in some ways to Christians, but that certainly didn't stop any of the violence. Some 60% of churches that were destroyed during his grip on the Syrian government were ultimately attributed to his military forces. So now the new president, Ahmed al-Shara, he's attempted to make inroads with Christians. He has a Catholic woman, for example, in his transitional administration, and he's made some claims of support for minorities, but there's little evidence existing that he'll actually defend believers in any real way. And there's reason actually to be pretty skeptical of that. Attacks have reportedly gone up since he took over, and it's critical to note, of course, that he himself is a former jihadist. He was the leader of the Al-Nusra Front and formerly pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda, that he's now trying to distance himself from terrorism to be seen as a legitimate leader on the world stage. So time is going to tell ultimately, but there's no doubt that this is a dangerous time for Christians in Syria. We should add, too, that the World Watch List from Open Doors, they rank Syria as number 18 on their list.
Yeah, and yeah, some of the points there about al-Shara very important. He reportedly fought against U.S. forces in Iraq. If you go back
Yeah,
here, I mean, this is a
right.
person who, I mean, you're talking about a very radical person. That doesn't mean people don't change, but I think that skepticism over, and this is one of the big problems. Even as we talk about regime change being floated in Iran, right? A lot of times when there's a vacuum, you get rid of something bad. And I'm not saying this isn't a reason to not do something or do it, but the reality is you get rid of something bad, you end up sometimes with something far worse. And
Yeah.
so it seems like in Syria, we're still sort of waiting to see what that's actually going to look like. Is he going to make good on what you were just describing, these promises of being more moderate and respecting Christians' rights, or is the situation going to be terrible? And part of that depends on how they react to situations like this. So, when I say they, I mean the government. Are they going, if they don't react strongly, then the people, the radicals in the country, are going to say, well, we can treat these minority groups however we want. So what has the response been so far?
So, the Syrian government information minister immediately condemned the attack, calling it a terrorist attack and writing on X, "This cowardly act goes against the civic values that bring us together." He continued, "We will not back down from our commitment to equal citizenship, and we also affirm the state's pledge to exert all its efforts to combat criminal organizations and to protect society from all attacks threatening its safety." So there's been a strong response from the Syrian government so far. And then the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, Thomas Barrack, he called the attack an act of cowardice, saying in a statement that it has no place in the new tapestry of integrated tolerance and inclusion that Syrians are weaving. And leaders, of course, from other countries all around the world in the West and otherwise have condemned the attack.
All right, so we'll have to continue monitoring that and praying for the victims and their families. That brings us to today's main thing, and this week marks the third anniversary of Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. That was the case, the Supreme Court case that overturned Roe v. Wade and holding that there was no federal constitutional right to abortion. Susan B. Anthony List, Emily Davis spoke with Madison Seals about where the pro-life movement stands 3 years later and what is next. Here is Emily on today's main thing.
In the aftermath of Dobbs, state courts began playing a crucial role in defining the scope of abortion rights at the state level. Some states even had trigger laws and other bans in place that tried to immediately block abortions after those federal protections disappeared. So, Emily, can you talk about how many states now have pro-life laws in place?
Yes, absolutely. And we are so thankful to be able to celebrate the third anniversary of Dobbs. It really is one of those historical moments where you just say to yourself, where was I when this happened? Because for decades, people thought Roe was indestructible. So this is such a celebration. And today, we are thankfully able to say that 23 states have laws protecting life in the first trimester, and 21 of which safeguard babies at conception or once a heartbeat is detected. So if you can imagine, that is a drastically different landscape than what we had before, where you were having later abortions and late-term abortions happening throughout states across this country.
What kind of effect have those states had on the number of abortions nationwide? Have we seen those numbers change?
Well, when you look at the states that had implemented pro-life laws, what's really wonderful and beautiful to see is that the states have been able to drive those abortions down to virtually to no abortions, to no life-ending measures for the baby in the womb. But the reason why it's difficult to pin a number on it is because, sadly, but maybe not shockingly for your audience, the pro-abortion activists, the pro-abortion left, they already had a plan in place prior to the Dobbs decision. And that really came in the form of abortion drugs being pushed through the mail. In fact, if most people will remember, it was President Biden who used COVID-19 as a rationale to say, well, now we have to send abortion drugs through the mail. And then, oh, by the way, 1 year later, year and a half later, it's going to become permanent. So that all happened prior to the Dobbs decision. And that is the landscape that we are in. That is why, as much as we can celebrate, and there are plenty worth celebrating, believe me, there is still a ton of work to do, especially when the left is pushing self-managed by male abortions to women and girls. It's just unconscionable.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about the abortion pill here in a minute because that is a huge focus of the pro-life movement and has been for the last year or so. But first, are there any new legal questions that have come up in the last 3 years that are impacted by the Dobbs decision?
Well, I will say something that is so unique to this moment and important is that, yes, we get to celebrate the third anniversary of Dobbs, and it was the most historic decision for life. And now we're up against another earth-shattering, historic, amazing moment for the pro-life movement. And that is the fact that we are on the precipice of Congress potentially defunding big abortion led by Planned Parenthood. They That is something that has been 52 years of forced taxpayer funding of the abortion industry. And so if we can rally around and have the one big beautiful bill, President Trump's one big beautiful bill pass, that means that we will see forced taxpayer funding of abortion businesses led by Planned Parenthood, potentially defunding. And that is their largest source of funding.
That's incredible. And like you said, that's been in the works for decades now. And the pro-life movement is still at work, as you're saying. It's still very active. As many of our listeners know from watching our yearly coverage of the March for Life in January, the crowds are still showing up. This issue is still important to people because there are still babies that are being sacrificed on the altar of abortion. So what is the current focus of the pro-life movement? What are we really working on right now?
At this moment, we are all rallying around and also unified around really and truly defunding big abortion led by Planned Parenthood. And just some numbers to put this in perspective. You still have Planned Parenthood with their last annual report showing that they took the lives of more than 400,000 boys and girls last year, while still receiving $2 million in taxpayer funding. And so some people might say, well, what about the Hyde Amendment? I thought that we weren't allowed to federally fund abortion. And yes, technically you are right. However, this has been 52 years of taxpayer funding for the abortion industry. So they're pretty crafty. They're shrewd. They understand how to get around these things, and they slice and dice services and are still able to fund. And they've really oriented their business model around taxpayer funding. And that's why you see that the top services, the top growth areas for them over the last few years have been abortion and trans treatment. The services that have plummeted, that are just going down, down, down drastically, are the non-abortion services. And not to mention, they also spend millions, tens of millions of dollars endorsing and funding the political campaign of the left, of Democrats. So why are we as taxpayers funding them? Why is that happening? And that's what we are rallying against. We would love to see the defunding of big abortion led by Planned Parenthood.
What do you see as the next main issues or focuses or challenges of the pro-life movement?
For me right now, like I said, the defunding is key. That's really, really important. But the next landscape that we're looking at is what I alluded to earlier, which is the fact that the left and abortion activists are targeting women and girls in their homes now with abortions, and they are pushing abortion drugs. That is just something that was not a phenomenon, 10, 20 years ago. But since the Biden administration loosened those regulations, that is tragically the landscape that we are in right now. And we've been hearing from women who have been harmed by this. Just a few years ago, Democrats and pro-abortion activists would have said the worst thing possible is for a woman to self-manage her own abortion. And now they're pushing that, even prior to the Dobbs decision, but especially now. So we have really got to do our very best to make sure that we're calling for the FDA to review the safety of the drugs. And we're confident that once they review them, they'll understand that this is not okay. We're heartened by the fact that Senator Josh Hawley heard from the FDA that they will be reviewing these drugs. And so that is something that we are looking forward to and pushing for, and just really standing by to make sure that, both babies in the womb and women are protected.
Thank you, Madison. It's hard to believe it's been 3 years since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. It's an issue, abortion, that really has not calmed down in terms of debate, as it continues to be fought over in all 50 states, and we'll continue to cover the issue as there are new developments. That leaves us time for one last thing. Today's verse is Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. That's a powerful verse, and it's speaking obviously about our own lives, the way we interact, the way we deal with other people. And sometimes, as we're seeing on the world stage, peace is not always possible. Sometimes people have to take a stand against evil, but in our own lives, trying to find peace wherever we can.
Yeah, absolutely. If we are Christians, we should back up what we say we believe with our actions, and one of the fruits of the Spirit is peace. We ought to exemplify that in our own lives.
Absolutely, and it's such an important value. That is all the time we have today. If you want a Christian perspective to the news, you've got to subscribe to this show. Again, you can email us quickstartpodcast@cbn.org with your thoughts on the show. And don't forget to subscribe to the CBN Quick Start email newsletter as well. Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see you back here tomorrow.